This is lesson 4 of the lecture International Economics. I will discuss slide 91 to 107 of chapter 1, International Trade. According to the explanation for international trade we have discussed so far, international trade should take place primarily between countries which are different with respect to their relative endowment with production factors, technological development, or consumer preferences. This is what we have just analyzed in section 1.2.1. However, from an empirical point of view, a lot of trade takes place between countries which are quite similar with respect to their development level, endowment with production factors, or consumer preferences. This lesson will explore a new theory of international trade, which explains why a lot of trade can also take place between countries which are basically identical. This theory explains trade by economies of scale. So the name of this section is Trade Caused by Economies of Scale. According to the classical trade theory considered so far, a country will export goods which it does not import, and vice versa. This type of trade is called inter-industrial trade, trade between different industries. However, most developed countries export goods of the same industries of which they also import goods. This type of trade is called intra-industrial trade. The following diagram shows this from an empirical perspective. This diagram shows the share of German exports and imports which take place with other countries of the European Union. It shows that over the years, significantly more than 50% of German trade, of all German trade, is realized with countries of the European Union. Since the countries of the European Union have reached a similar state of development as Germany and are at the same time quite scarcely endowed with natural resources, Germany should not be engaged in trade with these countries according to the classical trade theory. Instead, Germany should be much more engaged in international trade with countries which are more different from Germany. For example, countries in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. This diagram shows the share of major product groups in German exports and imports. On the left side we have the diagram for German exports to European countries. On the right side we have the diagram for German imports from European countries. According to the classical trade theory we have discussed so far in the preceding section, Germany should not export the same type of goods which it also imports. However, if you compare both diagrams, they show that Germany holds the largest share of its imports in the same product group as its exports: cars, chemicals, machinery, food, and electrical equipment. How can we explain this large share of intra-industrial trade in German trade? The American economist Paul Krugman has addressed this problem in a series of research papers and explained how trade between relatively similar countries, like the countries of the European Union, can be explained by economies of scale in production. Now, to remember, economies of scale can be internal or external. Internal economies of scale mean that average costs depend negatively on the company size. So the larger the company, the lower the average costs. Larger companies can produce at lower average costs than smaller companies as a consequence. What are the causes for this? Typically, greater productivity of large production plants caused by fixed cost degression or market power, and that results in volume discount for production factors or intermediate goods. There exist also external economies of scale. They are explained in the following digression. They're quite interesting, I think, because they explain not only international trade between countries which are similar, they can also explain why certain type of industries form regional clusters within countries. I think this is quite interesting. It's explained in the following digression, but if you ask, this digression is not relevant for the written examination. So I will argue the following with internal economies of scale to make the argument a little bit simpler and more focused. So we will focus on internal economies of scale only. Internal economies of scale can be a reason for gains from trade. That's important. They represent gains from trade which are basically completely independent from the classical gains from trade found by Ricardo and Heckscher-Ohlin. The following simplified numerical example shows why this is the case. So in this table I have summarized, in a sense, a production function for a car producer, which for simplicity produces cars only with labor input. Of course, this is not realistic, but makes the whole analysis simpler. It is also possible, of course, to give this explanation based on a more realistic example. If you like this, you are invited to look it up in the book of Paul Krugman, which I have recommended at the beginning of this chapter. So let's focus on this simplified version. We have in this table labor input measured, let's say, in 1,000 or 100,000 working hours. Dimension plays no role. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. This is labor input measured by working hours. This is car output measured by the number of cars produced by the workers. And now we can, in the last column of this table, calculate labor productivity, the numbers of cars produced by 1 unit labor input. In the first line, this is 100 cars over 10 units labor input, so we receive 10 cars per unit labor input. And the second line, it is 20 units labor input, 300 cars, so labor productivity is 300 cars over 20 units labor input, which means 15 cars per unit labor input. So the number of cars per unit labor input is growing That means we have growing labor productivity. If we would produce 4,800 cars with a number of workers equal to 60, labor productivity would be 4,800 over 60, which results in 80 cars per unit labor input. So definitely labor input productivity is growing. That is what we call increasing returns to scale, because this higher labor productivity implies lower average production costs. Let's assume that these are given for technological reasons, which we will not further explore here. Now, to further simplify the analysis in the following, let's make the assumption that only two countries exist. I will call these countries Germany and Italy. Now, in both countries, all cars are produced with an identical production technology, the one I have just displayed with the help of the table. As a consequence of increasing labor productivity, average costs are decreasing. That's necessarily the case. Now, let's also assume that two equally large consumer groups exist in Germany and Italy with different preferences for two types of cars. One consumer group in Germany and Italy prefer a car called Ferrari. Their ideal product is Ferrari. They like most Ferraris. The other consumer group in both countries, Germany and Italy, have an ideal product, prefer as an ideal product only Porsches. Since both consumer groups are equally large, total demand curves for both types are identical. Now let's assume that every country has 60 labor units available for the production of cars. Now, what would result, what kind of production structure would result under autarky? Since the strength of demand is the same for Porsches and Ferraris, as we have assumed, in Italy, half of all workers, instead of 60, 30 workers would produce Porsches and 30 workers would produce Ferraris. If we take now a look at our productivity table, we find that 30 workers can produce 600 units of cars. Hence, 30 workers which produce Porsches produce 600 Porsches. The 30 workers which produce Ferraris produce 600 Ferraris. That's what I have noted here. So total car production would be 1,200 units, 1,200 cars. In Germany, the demand strength of both consumer types is identical, so Germany would also, under autarky, split up its total labor force for car production into two units. 30 units of workers produce Porsches and 30 working units produce Ferraris. So total number of cars produced in Germany would also be 1,200 units. If we add up now total production, the world production of Porsche and Ferrari, then taken together 1,200 Porsches would be produced and 1,200 Ferraris. Now let's assume that we leave the state of autarky and allow for free trade. Now, it would be of advantage if both countries specialize in the production of just one car type. For example, if Italy specializes in the production of Ferraris, it would be able to produce 4,800 Ferraris. And if at the same time Germany specializes in the production of Porsches, Germany would be able to produce 4,800 Porsches. So total world production would now grow from 1,200 Porsches to 4,800 Porsches, and from 1,200 Ferraris to 4,800 Ferraris. Let's take again a look at our table to see why this is possible. Well, in autarky we have split up the labor force into two groups of 30 labor inputs, and each group was able to produce 600 cars of every type. If we focus now and concentrate the production in every country on just one car type, we can take the 60 working units of every country and produce only one car type. In this case, we would be able to produce 4,800 cars in every country, which explains now the increase in total production in the case of free trade. Free trade allows us to specialize in the production of one car type and export the excess production and import the excess demand. In the following, this numerical example is demonstrated graphically. So here we have two countries, Germany and Italy. Under autarky, both countries cannot trade with each other, so they are closed by these red frames. In the above diagram we have the average cost curve in Germany's Porsche production. In the lower diagram we have the average cost curve for Germany's Ferrari production, and the same is the case on the side of Italy. Now, under autarky we have the assumption of identical production technologies, so the position of the average cost curve is identical in both countries and both industries. We have also assumed equal demand strength. This would imply that total car workers are split up in Germany and Italy in two equally sized groups, and every group produces 600 Porsches and 600 Ferraris in Italy and Germany. This is the result we have under autarky. Now we move from autarky to free trade. It is now possible that the production is concentrated, the production of every car type is concentrated in one country. So a random increase of Porsche production in Germany would be sufficient to cause lower average costs in the German production of Porsches, and thus further expansion of the Porsche production in Germany. So these autarky production points are not stable. Small change would cause a long-run development into the specialization of one car type. Since the Porsche production in Germany can pay higher wages due to higher labor productivity, the workers are moving into the Porsche production and leave the German Ferrari production. So the production of Ferraris goes to zero. German Porsches are now cheaper than Italian Porsches. So workers are dismissed in the Italian Porsche production and move into the Italian Ferrari production. Since the demand strength is the same in both countries, Italy exports half of its Ferrari production to Germany, and Germany exports half of its Porsche production to Italy. The increase in total production from 1,200 to 4,800 cars corresponds to the gains from trade, which is caused now by declining average costs, and in this case divided equally between both countries. To sum up, free trade allows a better exploitation of economies of scale, such that 4,800 units per car type can be produced instead of only 1,200 units per car type under autarky. With the same number of workers, more Ferraris and more Porsches can be produced under free trade. In the presence of economies of scale, specialization by free trade allows productivity gains. The example shows how economies of scale cause gains from trade. However, trade, which means import and exports of Porsches and Ferraris, is organized by the companies not because they want to realize gains from trade on a macroeconomic scale, but because gains from trade increase the company profits. This example shows also trade emerges between Germany and Italy caused only by economies of scale, even though we have assumed that both countries are identical and produce the goods with identical production factors. Both goods belong to the same industry, the car industry, so the resulting trade is intra-industrial trade. For countries which have reached the same level of development with regard to their production technologies, consumer preferences, relative factor endowment, like Germany and Italy, economies of scale can still give rise to international trade. Okay, so much for this lesson. In the next lesson, we will start with an empirical example how the so-called North American Auto Pact between the USA and Canada give rise to the intra-industrial trade with cars between both countries. This practical example will show how the economies of scale mechanism, which we have discussed in this lesson from a theoretical perspective only, works in reality.